All right, everyone, good morning. We're going to move on to section 9.3. I think we're on, section 9.3 in our algebra journal. So let's go hit this. There's going to be a lot of square roots. You're going to need your calculator, so go ahead and grab that right now. Right off the bat, they have us graphing a few parabolas, so might as well play along with them. Let's take a look at letter A, and the first thing we're going to do is find our axis of symmetry. Remember that equation. Axis of symmetry is x equals negative b over 2a. Taking a look at letter A, A is going to be 1, B is 0, and C equals negative 4. So my axis of symmetry is 0 over 2 times 1, negative 0 over 2 times 1. Negative 0 divided by 2 is 0. So I'm going to draw a axis of symmetry at x equals 0. We'll do another zoom in here. The other thing to look at is our C is negative 4, so that means we can put our y-intercept at y equals negative 4. And then from here, you might want to remember about how A is used. A is used to locate the corresponding 2 points closest to the vertex. And if A is 1, that means we go over 1 and then up 1. So A tells us how far up or how far down to go from the vertex. Okay, we got 3 dots. If you like, you can draw your parabola from here. Personally, I know that if you go 2 over, then you would go up 4. If A was a different number, say 2, then you would multiply 4 by that new number, by A. So 4 times 2 would have been 8. But since A is 1, we're only going to go up 4. Let's graph it. So there's our nice looking parabola, and let's zoom out from that just a little bit now, and we'll move on. In this next section here, we're supposed to use our calculator to, calculate x squared minus 5. So we'll do this first one for you. How much is 2.21 squared? Computer, how much is 2.21 squared minus 5?
The answer to your calculation is minus 0.1159.
0.1159 is about negative 0.116. Go ahead, pause here, and solve the rest of these. And that should give you this result. I want to point you out to the really interesting part of this, and that is right here. Somewhere between x equals 2.23 and x equals 2.24, the sign of x squared minus 5 changes from negative to positive. So that indicates to me that somewhere in between 2.23 and 2.24, x squared minus 5 has to be equal to 0. So if I want to estimate that, I'm just going to go ahead and say what's exactly in the middle of 2.23 and 2.24, and that is x equals 2.235. And then furthermore, what I'm concluding here is that around x equals 2.235, x squared minus 5 is equal to 0. All right, and let's see what we have. Are the equations x squared minus 5 and x squared equals 5, are they the same? And the answer is yes. They are just one algebraic operation apart. Notice if you take this first one right here and you add 5 to both sides, you get this second equation here. So that's what we mean by saying they're one algebraic equation apart. Use the square root key on a calculator to estimate the solutions. That's kind of what we did in Exploration 2. So from Exploration 2, we have that x would be about equal to 2.235. Okay. What is the exact solution? Well, this means you're going to plug it into your calculator. So in your calculator, once you solve this, let's add 5 to both sides. You get x squared equals 5, and x is therefore going to be equal to the square root of 5. And you could just ask your calculator, what is the square root of 5? Computer, what is the square root of 5?
The square root of 5 is 2.2361.
So that's the exact solution. This is actually what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be using our calculator to figure out the square root of values to solve their equations. So let's move on to communicate your answer. So this is something that students aren't very accustomed to. We're not asking them to solve this, although I am going to solve this just to show how this thought process happens. We're trying to figure out how many solutions are there to this quadratic equation. So the first thing we're going to do here is, if I take a look at ax squared plus c equals 0, I'm going to subtract c from both sides. After I subtract c from both sides, you'll notice that on the left side, the c minus c is 0, and of course on the right side, 0 minus c is just negative c. Okay, here, normally what we do is we divide by a, but that's not really important to us. We're just going to square root right now. We're going to assume a is a positive number. So let's square root here. Okay, we're going to square root both sides of the equation, and what we get is the following. Notice how we're taking a square root of negative c. So what we're saying is that if c, negative c is equal to 0, which is the same thing that c is equal to 0, well, the square root of 0 is 0, so that means we have only one solution. Okay. What happens if negative c is greater than 0? Well, any positive value that you take a square root is going to have two solutions. So if negative c is greater than 0, which is the same thing as saying c is less than 0, you're going to get two solutions. And lastly, if negative c is less than 0, you're going to get no solutions. Or if c is greater than 0, you get no solutions. And if you don't like memorizing this, I don't like memorizing this, what you can remember is that if you take the square root of 0, you get one solution. So take a look at what you're going to be square rooting at the end. If you take the square root of a positive number, you get two solutions. And if you take the square root of a negative solution, you get 0 solutions. Okay. So the number 5 is going to ask us to find the exact solution and then to use a calculator to estimate. So let's see what we got. So the first thing I'm going to notice is that this is the same thing as x squared plus negative 2 equals 0. And since the c is less than 0, we're going to get two solutions. So now we got to solve this. So the first thing to do is add 2 to both sides of the equation, and that gets us x squared equals 2. Next, we're going to square root both sides of the equation, and that gets us x is equal to the positive and negative square root of 2. Now that's the exact solution. Square root of 2 does not have an exact answer like 2, 3, 5, or 6. It's going to be some decimal. It's what we would call a transcendental number. So what is the square root of 2? Just ask your calculator. You get positive and negative 1.414. For 3x squared minus 18 is equal to 0, the first thing that you're going to want to do is add 18 to both sides. and you get is 3x squared equals 18. After you've done that, you're going to want to solve for x squared. So you're going to divide everything by 3. So divide by 3, and you get x squared equals 6. Now that you've got that, you're going to apply a square root on both sides, and that's the key. The square root goes on both sides. So what you get is x equals positive and negative square root of 6. And if you ask your computer, what is the square root of 6? It'll say 2.449. So there we go. We've solved that equation. Vocabulary, square root. You guys have already met the square root before. The square root is a math operation that's going to solve the square root of a perfect square equals x. Actually, it doesn't even have to be a perfect square. So since the square root of 3 squared equals 3, then the square root of 9 is equal to 3. That's how we do a square root. The zero of the function, which we have met, I swear we've done this a few times already. The zero of the function, which we call the roots also, those are the places where a function crosses the x-axis. So here are some core concepts. If we're solving an equation where x squared equals d, if d is greater than 0, that means we're taking a square root of a positive number, and we'll have two solutions. If d happens to be 0, that means we're taking the square root of 0. And there is only one square root of 0, so there's only one solution. Finally, if d is less than 0, that means we're taking a square root of a negative number, which you can't do. So there are no solutions. Okay, moving on down to the extra practice. We're going to look at number 1. And number 1 tells us x squared plus 49 equals 0. So the first thing that you want to do to solve this is subtract 49 from both sides. There we go. We've subtracted 49 from both sides, and we get x squared equals negative 49. Now remember what comes next, the square root. And we're going to take a square root of a negative number here. So what does that mean for us? Well, that means there's no solution. The square root of negative 49 doesn't exist. So remember, if you're taking the square root of a negative number, there is no solution. Moving on to number 2, the first thing you're going to want is to add 25 to both sides. So if we add 25 to both sides, we get x squared equals 25. And then now you're going to apply that square root to both sides. And then you will get x is equal to plus a negative 5. Now that's a nice one. That one works about as well as you can possibly expect it to. Taking a look at number 6, I notice that x squared is actually negative x squared, and I don't like that. So what I'm going to do is multiply both sides by negative 1. Let's remember how to do that. We're going to put parentheses around the left side and just put a times negative 1 on the far left. And then we're going to put parentheses around the right side, in this case negative 12, and we're going to put a times negative 1 on the outside. So if you multiply everything by negative 1, that basically changes all the signs. So negative x squared becomes x squared, minus 12 becomes plus 12, and then what did I do here? It looks like this is a mistake. That's better. Negative 12 becomes 12. The next thing you're going to do is subtract 12 from both sides, and you get x squared equals 0. And then you can think about taking the square root of 0, or actually just take the square root of 0, and you get yourself that x is equal to 0. Okay, we're moving on to question 10. And in question 10, I think the first thing that we're going to want to do is subtract 1 from both sides. Sorry, add 1 to both sides. And so you get 16x squared equals 1. After you're done with that, divide both sides by 16. you'll get x squared equals 1/16. Square root both sides, and when you're taking a square to the right side, you're just taking the square root of the numerator and denominator separately. Don't freak out. The square root of 1 is 1, and the square root of 16 is 4. So you get x equals positive and negative 1/4. Okay. Number 12, it looks like the first thing that we're going to want to do is probably multiply both sides by -1, because I'm seeing that we have a negative 2x squared, and I don't like a being negative. So I'm going to multiply everything by -1. Okay, we multiply both sides by -1, and we get a reversal of every sign. So 16 becomes -16, negative 2x squared becomes plus 2x squared, and 16 becomes -16. Your next step here is to add 16 to both sides, and you get 2x squared equals 0. How nice. You can divide by 2, and you'll get x squared equals 0, and then, square root 0. I know what you know what the square root of 0 is. It's just 0. So the answer to 12 is just 0. Now for 14, we're heading into some really tough algebraic territory. You notice that we've got the square of an expression this time, and I'm trying to tell you that it doesn't matter what you have squared. The solution is going to be done the same way. So since I have a square equal to 196, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Okay, so the square root of both sides. The square root of a perfect square is just what it is. And the square root of 196, and I remember this from yesterday, it was 14, positive and negative 14. The next thing to do is subtract 2 from both sides, because we are solving for x. And if I subtract 2 from both sides, I get myself this expression. X equals -2 plus or minus 14. Okay, so that's actually 2 solutions in one, written in a really compact form. So we're going to unpack that. We're going to start off with first the subtraction, because remember we're saying -2 plus or minus 14. Well, what about the minus 14 part? So x is equal to -2 minus 14, which I'm sure you know is -16. Or what happens if we decided to add 14 instead? Well, if you decided to add 14, you get x equals -2 plus 14, which is the same thing as x equals 12. So those are our 2 solutions, x equals -16 or x equals 12, okay? So be careful when you're doing these. Do the 2 solutions separately. Just because you found a -16 doesn't mean that positive 16 is also the solution. I see some weird things. That's not what you want to do. You want to do all of the algebra. Let's scroll back down to the rest of these problems. And 16 is a good example of something here. Notice how I have the 16 on the left side. Well, as I'm solving square root problems, I want to get everything out of the way of the square. Notice that you have the quantity of x minus 3 squared. You want to get rid of that 16. So when you get rid of that 16 by dividing both sides, you get this nice fraction, 25 over 16. If you remembered your perfect squares, you know exactly why that's a nice fraction. The left side is x minus 3 squared. So when you have something squared and it's equal to a number, the same thing happens. You're going to square root both sides. So let's apply our square root to both sides. And on the left side, you'll notice that that just gets rid of the square. But on the right side, you get the square root of 25 over the square root of 16, which is 5 over 4, plus and minus 5 over 4. Now, we're going to work this just like we did with the previous problem. We're going to add 3 to both sides. So as I add 3 to both sides, that gives me 2 solutions. It's either going to be 3 minus 5 over 4 or 3 plus 5 over 4. At this point, you might want to grab your calculator and figure out that 5 over 4 is the same thing as 1.25. So we're going to do the subtraction first. And if I no, my bad, we did the addition first. So if I do 3 plus 5 over 4, that's going to get me 3 plus, well, I guess we did this in fraction first, 17 over 4. That's 12 over 4 plus 5 over 4 is 17 over 4. And if I do the subtraction part next, that's 3 minus 5 over 4, which is 12 over 4 minus 5 over 4, or 7 over 4. And remember when I said you might want to start thinking about the 1.25 thing here? Well, what is 3 plus 1.25? 3 plus 1.25. 3 plus 1.25 is 4.25, and 3 minus 1.25 is 2.75. So you have those to deal with. 1.75. So let's move on to question, I think it's number 12. And with number 12, this is basically the same thing that we did or have been doing, but now we're going to use our calculator to evaluate the square root. So the first thing you're going to want to do for 12 is clear away everything from the square side, which means that you're going to have to add 12 to both sides. I'm sure you know 3 plus 12 is 15. Now that you have x squared equals 15, you're going to square root both sides. Okay. And that gets us where now x is just whatever the square root of 15 is. And if you grab your calculator and check it, you're going to get 3.873. Don't forget it's plus and minus root 3.873. And this finally brings us to question 25. So a ball is dropped from a window that's 81 feet high, and the function h equals negative 16x squared plus 81 represents the height in feet of the ball after x seconds. How long will it take for the ball to hit the ground? Well, hopefully you'll know enough about the way that these equations work to know that if something hits the ground, that means its height is 0. So we're starting off with height equals 0. And do I have anything that I can use for height? Well, I notice that there is an equation here for height. It is negative 16. Let's highlight that. The height is negative 16x squared plus 81. So instead of saying h equals 0, I could just say that negative 16x squared plus 81 equals 0, since those two equations are equivalent. And now this becomes a math problem. Obviously, we're learning math. So, clear out for the square root. Let's subtract 81 from both sides. And that gets us to negative 16x squared equals negative 81. Still clearing out for the square root, so we're dividing by 16. And we get ourselves x squared equals 81 over 16, which is a nice number. If you memorize that list of perfect squares, you know exactly why that's a nice number, because the square root of 81 over 16 is the square root of 81 over the square root of 4. Sorry, the square root of 16, which is plus and minus 9 over 4. So those are our two solutions. Let's convert those into decimals. And the first decimal we get is 9 divided by 4, which is 2.25. And then we get negative 9 divided by 4, which is negative 1.25. Oops. But remember that, how do I drop a ball from a height of negative 2.25? Well, you don't. You can only drop a ball from a height of 2.25. I'm sorry. X is seconds. How does a ball hit the ground at negative 2.25 seconds? I don't know. But 2.25 seconds I do know. So how long does it take for the ball to hit the ground? That is 2.25 seconds. So that's it, everyone. This is our 9.3, right? Yeah, 9.3. These have all been pretty long, but this is actually real math stuff. This is the kind of solving that you would even see in a, calculus class, heaven forbid. So I'll see you next time. Have a good night.